going to call Dr. Rogalska to the stand.
And Doctor, I have asked every witness if they're able to safely and responsibly testify without a mask to do so. I think you're in a position where you believe you need to wear your mask. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And as long as you're close to the microphone so we can all hear your voice, that will be adequate. I'll ask you to please stand and my clerk will administer the oath.
Do you solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Good morning. Could you please state both your first and last name and spell both for the record?
Yes. Good morning. My name is Agnieszk Rogalska. That's spelled A, G as in Gregory, N as in Nancy, I, E as in Ernest, S as in Sam, Z as in Zebra, K as in Catherine, A as in Apple. Last name Rogalska, R-O-G as in Gregory, A-L, S as in Sam, K as in Catherine, A as in Apple.
How are you employed?
I am the Chief Medical Examiner of Dane County.
I'm now going to approach you with Exhibit 367. Outside of your recent promotion, does Exhibit 367 appear to be a true and accurate copy of your curriculum vitae or CV?
It does.
I would move Exhibit 367 into evidence at this time.
No objection.
It is received.
And Doctor, I just briefly want to go through some of your educational and work background. Where did you attend medical school?
I attended medical school in Poland at the Karol Marcinkowski University of Medical Sciences.
And after finishing your medical degree in Poland, what sort of residency did you participate in?
I completed a 4-year residency in anatomic and clinical pathology at the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Where did you work after that?
After that, I completed a 1-year fellowship, specifically training in forensic pathology with the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
And have you worked anywhere else as a medical examiner?
I have.
Where would that be?
I worked in Milwaukee for 5 years as an assistant medical examiner before coming to Dane County.
And how long have you worked in Dane County?
I began my employment in Dane County in 2015.
And what is your current title?
I am currently the Chief Medical Examiner of Dane County, serving Rock, Brown, Door, and Oconto counties.
And what does a medical examiner do?
Essentially, the role of a forensic pathologist who serves as a medical examiner in a county is to determine the cause and the manner of death in cases that are reported to our office. We don't have to investigate every death that happens in our jurisdictions. However, there are some cases that are not natural deaths, or we don't have a cause of death, or they might be suspicious or violent deaths. In those cases, it's the job of the forensic pathologist or the medical examiner to determine what the exact cause of death is, what the manner is, and to make sure that the death certification is appropriately completed. Also to ensure that an autopsy is performed or some form of examination, if needed, to document the cause of death and to make it available for purposes of the court.
And are you board certified in any areas?
I am board certified in anatomic and forensic pathology.
Okay, and what does it mean to be board certified?
Board certification is essentially an exam that allows you, it essentially says that you meet the bare minimum criteria for your profession. You have to complete residency training before you can take an exam, and then you take it to say that you have a minimal amount of knowledge by the board that governs your field. The same thing for forensic pathology. It basically means not only did you complete the training course, but you have the requisite knowledge to practice independently in that field.
Okay. And approximately how many autopsies have you performed during your career?
I did the numbers a few days ago, and actually somewhere around 4,000, a little over 4,000.
And part of your practice is to write a report in each case?
Yes, in most cases.
Okay. And did you write a report in the case of Krista Halderson?
I did.
I am now going to show you what has been marked as Exhibit 368.
Thank you.
How would you identify Exhibit 368?
This is part of the medical examiner file on this case. It includes my autopsy report, or a copy of my autopsy report, as well as a copy of our investigative report. This would be written, comprised by our investigators in the course of their work on this case.
In association with this case, did you put together a presentation based on your report?
I did.
I'm going to show you what has been marked as Exhibit 370. I also have a USB of it, 369. Could you please look through Exhibit 370 and tell me if that is the presentation you prepared?
It appears to be, yes.
This time the state would move Exhibits 368 through 370 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection.
They are received.
And as we've done in this trial, could you please compare, this is an example copy that the jury will get. Will you please compare your 370 to a jury copy?
Yes.
As the witness is going through that process, ladies and gentlemen, I'll advise you that once again, it'll be necessary in this case for the state to utilize exhibits so that you understand the testimony and the evidence. That'll be done through the booklet format once again. The pages are numbered in the bottom right-hand corner as before, and your obligation as before is to at least observe the exhibits one by one. To the extent you do so is up to your own decision-making as jurors. Thank you.
I can flip through one if that's easier.
Sorry.
And actually, as before, I'll remind you to only turn pages in the booklet as the exhibit is being shown during the testimony, although you can go backwards if you wish at any point without losing your place, I hope.
And those appear to be exact copies of each other.
They do.
I'm now going to pass out Exhibit 370. Doctor, I've left Exhibit 368, your medical report, up there. If you need to refer to it at any time, that's fine, but the court would ask that you just note it for the record.
Thank you.
Counsel, I think we have an extra.
Yep, fabulous. Okay,
Thank you.
all right. Doctor, could you please turn to slide 2 in your presentation? On July 14th of 2021, Were you called out to a location in Roxbury DNR land?
I was.
And what was the purpose of you being called out there?
Human remains or suspected human remains have been found in this area. It's our policy in the office to respond to a potential homicide or potential human remains. Because we had already found other human remains that were confirmed as human, the doctor, myself, responded to this scene as well, rather than just an investigator initially.
Okay. And what is the jury looking at on slide 2?
On slide 2, the jury is just looking at a photograph of the scene and the parkway. This is part of the trail through which we went in order to get to those remains.
Let's turn to slide 3. What is the jury looking at with slide 3?
Here you're looking again at the scene. We've moved a little bit further away from the parking lot. I believe that in the left hand of the photograph is part of the river or the river bed, and we are walking across this to go further into an open area of the parkway.
And how would you describe this area in general? Was it remote? Were there a lot of people around? Something else?
At the time that I was there, there weren't a lot of people around other than sheriff's deputies. There was a parking lot and a small area of, I'm not sure if they were camper units or small cabins off of the parking lot. I'm not sure if those were residences or just temporary camping sites, but a handful of domestic kind of units. There was the parking lot, and the rest of it is, as you see in the photographs, essentially just forest, trees, and prairie.
All right, and turning to slide 4, how would you describe slide 4?
Slide 4 is again on our way to the scene. This is where the forest opens up into a kind of prairie. One photograph wouldn't capture the entirety of it, but this is just the pathway that we were taking to get to the remains. You can see that this is an open field at this point.
It's a little bit hard to tell from slide 4, but how high was the grass or the weeds in that prairie area?
I don't recall that we took a measurement, but I would say that they're probably calf length. They weren't knee length, and there was a path already built, so we weren't struggling.
Okay. Could you please describe slide 5?
On slide 5, we've moved through a portion of the prairie, and we're now edging into the area where the remains were found. You can almost see a few of the bushes or a large tree in the middle of the photograph that seem to be a little bit closer to the prairie. We're actually going to be moving behind that area, which is where the remains were found.
Okay. And slide 6, could you describe that slide?
In slide 6, we're actually coming to the edge of that prairie. We've walked past that large tree that you saw in slide 5, and you're seeing a portion of that large tree on the left side of the photograph. In the middle of the photograph, you can't see from this distance, but for orientation purposes, this is where the remains are found.
Okay. Could you please describe picture 7 for the jury?
Yes. In picture 7, we've moved a little bit closer to that area where the remains are found. You'll note that there are red and blue circles on this photograph, and there are notes on the right side of this presentation, so you can orient yourself. Within the right circle, underneath the tree on the left side of the photograph, you can see this is where we'll find the remains of the left thigh, a left foot, and a right leg. And identified in the blue circle, under a smaller bush a little further away, is the left knee, identified here as the left leg.
In your identification, you have left thigh, comma, left foot, comma, right leg. Was the thigh dismembered from the foot, or the foot dismembered from the thigh?
Yes, what ultimately I believe to be the left thigh that joins that, the left knee that joins the left thigh and that left leg was identified in the area here circled in blue. So the right leg is intact from the thigh down. The left leg was fragmented. A portion was found in one area, the knee The thigh and the foot were found with the right leg.
And let's turn to slide 8. How would you describe slide 8 for the jury?
Slide 8 is now a close-up photograph of what we're seeing in the underbrush. This is still far enough away that you can't identify it, but as you were walking into the scene, you would see a fragment of dried brown parchment-like skin, and these remains correspond to the left thigh, the left foot, and the right leg, and they're identified with a yellow circle on your notes.
And as you're approaching these body parts, what, if anything, are you looking to sort of take in and observe?
From the perspective of a forensic pathologist, what I'm looking for initially are how many remains there are. First of all, I want to make sure I'm not screwing anything up in the pathway for those people who are qualified to look at the tracks and the scene, the law enforcement officers. But my main concern looking at the remains is to see if they are covered, are they buried, do they appear to be intact, do they even appear to be human remains, is there insect activity, is there animal activity? These are the things that I'm thinking about. Most of it I won't know until I get really close, but that's what I'm thinking about as I'm approaching this kind of scene.
And how would you describe slide 9?
So slide 9 is a photograph from the same position where I took the photograph in slide 8 from. This gives you some perspective as to the distance between the two piles of remains. So identified in the red circle is actually the left knee, identified here as left thigh, but it's actually a portion of the left thigh and that left knee and the left leg, that missing portion between the thigh and the foot that we saw in the other, identified in the other picture. So you can see that there's some distance between these two piles of remains. Here, this knee is actually visible, it's open, it's between some very thin, I believe they're called, they're not twigs, they're just saplings. Basically in a relatively open area in comparison to the rest.
And could you tell from your observations of being there whether or not it was purposely placed in a separate area or if it was later on by wildlife or something else? Is that something you could determine?
Well, purposely placed in the sense that these fragments had no reason to be there of their own accord. So the distance between them would not be accounted by any grade in the terrain, so it's not like it rolled down a hill. There was a slight a grade to it, but there was so much brush and shrubbery that it would not have, it would have stopped. There was no animal activity that I could discern on either the soft tissue or the bone. I would defer that to the anthropologist if there is any animal activity that I didn't recognize. There was no definitive explanation for the difference in the distance between them.
Okay. And what do you observe on picture 10?
So on picture 10, you're actually seeing my right foot, unfortunately in the field of the photograph, but in the center of the photograph, what you can see are these remains that were identified as the right leg, left thigh, and left foot. Now we're looking at them with a bird's eye view on top as opposed to through the brush. The brush hasn't been cleared, so this is exactly how these remains were found in the open. You can see that the skin is really dried and brown. It's called parchment-like. It's starting to mummify. You can see all of the gray little fragments that look like little pellets or rice grains. Those are actually maggots that are essentially starting to work on decomposing the body. And you can see that there's just grass around the area without any major coverage. There's nothing on top of these remains.
And doctor, I noticed looking at your foot that you appear to be wearing booties. Could you please describe how you are, or what attire or safety precautions you take when approaching human remains?
Anytime we approach a scene, we want to make sure that we're not tracking any evidence or DNA into the field. We're going to be handling this material, so it's even more important for us to be protected. We usually don a Tyvek suit, which is a full, essentially a bunny suit or footed pajamas, if you like, with a hood. We'll wear masks and gloves and eye protection. This is to keep our DNA or our person from being deposited on the remains or a body if we're looking at a homicide scene of a different kind.
And could you describe slide 11, please?
So in slide 11, now we are looking at a close-up view of the left knee that was found a little bit further away. You can see again that gray discoloration and some of those white fragments that are the maggots that are part of the decomposition process and the insect activity. You can see a fragment of exposed bone looking straight at the camera. And you can see that the skin here is a little bit different color. It is starting to putrefy a little bit. It is starting to dry a little bit, but it isn't as parchment-like or as mummified as the other remains.
And at some point, are these remains collected and taken back to your offices?
Yes, they are.
How are those remains collected?
We collected them in separate body bags just to keep the fragments separated until we can officially identify them. And just by looking at them with the naked eye like this, you can't really tell if they're from the same person. So we collected them as separate pieces. We placed them into a body bag. That body bag is zipped closed. The remains are actually, before it's zipped closed, placed into what's known as an evidence sheet. So it's a clean white sheet that covers those remains. Anything that would fall off would go into that evidence sheet. Then we place that into a white body bag, close it. We tie it with a zip tie with a numbered tag, and then we document that tag number and the time it was sealed, as well as by whom, and that is tracked throughout the rest of the autopsy and examinations that follow.
All right, and could you please describe what you observe in slide 12?
So in slide number 12, we've moved forward to the 16th of July. We are now in the autopsy suite. The remains have been placed on a blue sheet for the purpose of documentation and photographs. What we're looking at specifically on slide number 12 is a photograph of the right leg. In the corner, you'll see an L-shaped ruler. That's there for a couple of purposes. One, that gray ruler on the side actually has our medical examiner case number. That tells you the case number, and that gray fragmented ruler is also about 2 inches long, so that if you want to do some measurements for your own purposes, you know that's about how big that is. So here we can see the parchment-like dried, partially mummified right lower extremity or the right leg. You can see a fragment of skin that's attached to the side of that foot. You can see a fragment of the thigh in the upper corner, and we'll talk about that in a different slide.
And in examining the foot, were you able to estimate a shoe size?
I was able to get a measurement of the length of that foot, and it's 7.5 inches from toe to heel. Using just a Google search to find a scale for measuring shoe sizes, we came up with a shoe size of about 8. However, it must be remembered that the foot is partially mummified and desiccated. So this is not a definitive measurement. I can say that it's 7.5 inches from the longest toe to the heel.
Okay. Please describe what the jury is looking at in slide 13, please.
In slide 13, you're looking at the cut end of the skin of the right leg. What I'm showing here is that the thigh has relatively clean cuts along the edge of the skin with a couple of triangular, what are known as skin tags. One of the ways to distinguish a sharp force injury that's incurred by a sharp implement, such as glass, a knife, pair of scissors, is that the edge is going to be clean and relatively able to be put together. A blunt trauma that breaks skin, what's known as a laceration. So let's say that it's a fall and somebody tears that skin apart. That skin becomes very jagged and irregular. There's usually some scraping of the skin on the outside, and that helps us distinguish these two. The features that we're seeing here are relatively clean incisions. So this was done by a sharp object. The irregular fragments, those skin tags that are outlined by some of the red arrows, those are telling us that there's motion. This wasn't just a clean cut that went all the way around. This was a cut and a stop, and either the weapon is removed and put back in, which is what usually happens if you think about cutting something that's the length of a thigh. The sharp implement goes in and out, and every time it does, it doesn't go back in exactly into the same place. So you end up with a little bit of a skin tag. And this is also very characteristic of a sharp force injury.
And just for the record, your hand kind of made what I would describe as a sawing motion as you explained that. Is that accurate?
Correct, yes. Basically, I was demonstrating a sharp implement moving in and out as it's being either going across or into the object that it's cutting.
Doctor, what is the jury going to be seeing here in slide 14?
In slide 14, we're seeing that the bone here on the femur has been cut. So now we're looking at the bone, or that leg flipped over to the other side.
And what, if anything, can you tell us about this cut?
The most important thing has been outlined by the red arrow. It's a little bit hard to see because even though on the outside the tissue is brown and mummified, when we flip it over on the inside, everything looks gray. That's because it's essentially putrefying and it changes to that gray homogeneous color. But the red arrow is pointing to where the femur ends. That's the bone of the thigh. And you can see that this bone is also relatively smooth with a cut end. It doesn't look like, if you think of a chicken bone that you break, for example, you can see that it has splinters or jagged edges on the sides. Here we can see that that bone is relatively smooth and cut off in a diagonal.
And are you at all able to tell what sort of instrument created this cut, or is that for the forensic anthropologist?
I can say that there are definitely tool marks present, but I think the forensic anthropologist is in a better position with much more precise measurements to give the jury a sense of what type of tools might have been used.
All right, thank you. What do you observe on slide 15?
So on slide 15, we're again looking at the right leg, and now we're looking at the back. This is the popliteal fossa, or that little area behind your knee. And within that area is a single, kind of a teardrop-shaped defect. It's circled in the yellow circle on your slide.
And what would cause something like that?
There are multiple explanations. The first one being that it's possible insect activity. However, as you may have seen in a previous presentation, and even on these photographs you might note as well, the little holes that are associated with maggot activity called burr holes tend to be very small and round. They're usually just a few millimeters or fractions of an inch wide. This is a relatively large hole. It has characteristics that are similar to a stab wound. On one end, closest to that gray part of the ruler that has our medical examiner number, you can see that the end is pointed, but the opposite side is blunt. Now, with the amount of damage to the tissue and putrefaction, I can't say definitively that this is a stab wound, but it is suspicious for an injury with a sharp force injury, such as a single-edged knife.
Thank you. What are we looking at in slide 16?
In slide 16, we're actually looking at that same right leg, but now we've cut into the skin and we've moved it open. We sort of dissected it and splayed that soft tissue open. You can see that from the edge of the femur to the foot, the bone is intact. The muscle inside is putrefied. It's brown and yellow. But the interesting thing about it is that, except in the areas of insect activity at the edges, there is no blood. There is no hemorrhage. There's no area here that says that there was blood flow at the time any of these injuries were incurred.
So, doctor, are you saying that the person was dead at the time that the leg was removed from the body?
Most likely, yes.
And are there any signs that these wounds were, actually, strike that. Are there any other signs that you're able to detect that suggest that this was done post-mortem or after death?
The majority of the findings, if it was done antemortem, if there was blood flow to this leg, we would be seeing some hemorrhage. I examined this under the microscope as well. Sometimes we might see red blood cells that are associated, even if I can't identify them as such with the naked eye. There was no indication here of blood flow. The tissue, even though it's decomposed, would still have a darker color if there was blood, and there isn't any. That's the main factor that says that there was no movement and no flow of blood, and likely this was post-mortem.
Turning to slide 17, what is the jury observing here?
In slide 17, you're looking at a couple of things. Mainly, you're looking at the left foot on the side, and that's identified by that L-shaped ruler. In the circles, the two red circles, you're also seeing fragments of skin that were recovered with this tissue. If you recall, the intact tissue of the right leg had a fragment of skin on it. That is that layer of skin on the bottom of your foot. These both also have ridges on them that are characteristic with either a foot or a palm. One of them was still attached to the foot, and you could see the ridges. The one on the right leg still had circular ridges that were consistent with the ball of the foot where it was attached. Two fragments similar to this, the squamous epithelium had ridges that were consistent with a heel, and there was another fragment that had a ridge pattern consistent with the ball of the foot that was not attached to anything and was associated with this left foot.
Thank you. Turning to slide 18. Please describe slide 18 to the jury.
In slide 18, you're looking at the foot, but at the cut end. So now the sole of the foot is on the table, and you're basically looking down at the cut edge of the bone. Identified with the red arrows, you can essentially see what we talked about. The skin there is a nice smooth incision. It's basically a very smooth linear cut edge all the way around. You can see that the bone also is relatively smooth. However, you can also see identified by the green arrows that there appear to be kind of steps in the bone. Again, this is consistent with a sharp force injury that can be sawing or some sort of cutting, but again, we have movement and we have a ridge. It's not just cut clean through. At the very end, it almost looks as if there's a possibility that it was broken. Again, I would defer that to the forensic anthropologist about the very details of it. But from my perspective, I can see that the bone is being cut, and at some point the cuts are irregular and they're making little steps. And also there may be some breakage of the bone as well towards the end.
Turning to slide 19. Why did you take picture 19?
Could you repeat that?
Sure. What is picture 19? I said, why did you take picture 19, or what does it represent?
So picture 19 is that same left foot. Now we're looking at it from the side. We're looking at the outside of the ankle. And you can see, identified by the red arrows, the same sort of skin tags that we saw on the thigh. Again, we're looking at incisions, a cut that's being made around the ankle or the distal leg portion. And anytime that there's a movement in that sharp tool, either in or out or forwards and backwards, we're seeing a small skin tag being made. And we see that continued here on the foot as well.
And doctor, this is a small point, but there appear to be some twigs kind of stuck to that foot. Could you tell us about that?
I think those are just fragments from the scene. Again, if you remember, it was laid in that field, and that had some small short grasses, some dried grasses there. This was the best photograph that I had of these edges, but it's probably one of the earlier photographs before we removed some of the debris that was attached.
Sure. All right. What does slide 20 show us?
Slide 20, again, is showing the reflection of the skin. We tried to get as much off to look at the muscle underneath. Again, we're seeing that gray change associated with putrefaction, but we're not seeing any hemorrhage or any discoloration to indicate that there was blood flow at the time these injuries were incurred.
Again, suggesting it was postmortem.
Correct.
Turning to slide 21, what does slide 21 show you?
In slide 21, we're looking at the left thigh. The white arrows in the middle are identifying the types of holes that we see from maggot activity. We see this very commonly in mummified remains, and you can actually see them in museum exhibits if you're ever looking at a mummy. These are these nice, small, round holes that a maggot makes in order to get into the tissue or to get back out. In contrast to that, in the red arrows on the sides, again, we're looking at incisions or sharp force injuries on the skin. You can see the cuts are very broad and very jagged. You'll see them on both sides of the picture and also both sides of the cut ends of the thigh, So you can see cut ends on the distal portion as well as the proximal portion. Again, sharp incisions with skin tags. Inside the red circle, you're looking at the bone, the femur, and you can see that it also has a partially smooth edge, but now it's also making a jagged point, suggesting that we have both sharp and blunt force injuries involved.
Turning to slide 22, what is the jury observing in slide 22?
In slide 22, we're again looking at the left thigh, but now we're looking at a close-up of the bone. And the yellow arrow is showing us a nice smooth edge. Again, this is where the bone is being cut. But the red arrows are showing that we have jagged ends in part of the cortex, or the kind of circular rim, the hard part of the bone. And that is indicative of a blunt force injury, meaning not something that's done with a knife, but it could be either done with a different tool or it could be broken.
What does picture 23 show us?
In picture 23, we're looking straight down into that bone. Normally, when you would look down at bone, you would see a nice circular rim, which is the hard cortex, and inside is the medulla, the soft part where blood cells are made. But within that red circle inside of the marrow, what you actually see a fragment of bone. So this indicates that not only was this bone cut, as we've already seen in other photographs, but it confirms the fact that there was blunt trauma as well, because now a broken fragment of bone is actually tightly jammed into the marrow.
All right, turning to slide 24. What are we observing on slide 24?
On slide 24, we're looking at a very close-up view of the thigh and the bones from the left extremity. The green arrow is again showing us those nice, relatively smooth cut edges. They do have some irregularity to it, but in comparison to those identified by the red arrow, where we have peaks and valleys up and down, the green arrow is showing us sharp force injuries. The red arrows are showing us fragmented bone, so likely blunt force trauma or breakage of the bone. And in the middle of the photograph in the white box, you can see that you have linear cuts on the bone. So these linear incisions are essentially sharp force injuries or cuts that are made on the bone, most likely as the soft tissue or the skin is being cut.
Turning to picture 25. What does picture 25 illustrate?
So in picture 25, again, we've reflected all of the soft tissue of the bone. So you can see the bone in the middle, and on both sides of the bone is slightly gray, yellow, putrefied muscle and soft tissue. Again, there's no hemorrhage, there's no darkening areas that are consistent with a previous hemorrhage. So there's no evidence of blood flow at the time that these injuries were incurred.
Turning to slide 26. Could you please describe slide 26?
Yes. On slide 26, now we're looking at the left knee that was recovered separately. The white arrows are pointing toward the femur. So that's the leg part, the thigh part. And the double arrows in yellow are showing the tibia and the fibula. So those are the bones of the leg.
Turning to slide 27, what do we observe there?
Here on slide 27, we are looking at the distal or the far portion of the leg where the tibia and fibula are. What you're seeing identified by the white arrows is the edge of the skin, and you can see a very nice smooth cut all the way around. There are a few areas where it's jagged with those triangular skin tags or maybe some steps in the skin. But for the most part, it's a smooth cut all the way on this side.
Doctors, the cuts, some of them have been really smooth, some of them have been more jagged. What would account for that?
Many different things would account for it. It could be the result of using different tools. It could be the result of somebody being tired. It could be the result of different condition of the tissue. As essentially they're indicators of motion. So it basically means that the sharp object is moving either back and forth or in and out in a stab wound. Every time we have one of those irregularities, you know that the knife has come in a different direction, or the glass or whatever sharp implement you're using. In cases where we're seeing such vast differences, it could be either because of a difference in the condition of the tissue. We know that this left knee, for example, isn't as decomposed as the left thigh, the left foot, and the right leg. If it's mummified, the skin will be tougher and there might require different force. And again, if a different tool is being used, that could account for it as well.
And why would some of the body parts be more mummified than others? What could account for that?
Again, different conditions under which they were either stored or they were placed outside. A more shaded area is going to provide cooler air, maybe more moist air. That kind of tissue, if it's cooler, may not putrefy as quickly and it may not mummify. You need relatively dry, hot air for the mummification process to occur. There are also other factors that could be happening before they are, in this case, before they were placed into the park. Portions may have been kept refrigerated or frozen, or they may have been kept in a cooler place. There are many factors that go into it, so I can't say just one, but if I could tell you if one is consistent.
Okay, thank you. Turning to slide 28, what is significant about slide 28?
On slide 28, we're looking at the left knee again, and we're looking at the femur. So in the big white square in the middle, you can see again those kind of linear horizontal cuts on the bone. Those can be as a result of either cutting away the soft tissue or initial attempts at cuts that just didn't go all the way through. The red arrows are identifying the jagged edges of the bone. Again, this is indicative of blunt trauma, a fracture or a blow with a heavy object.
Turning to slide 29, what does slide 29 demonstrate?
So slide 29 is demonstrating, again, that right knee, but now we're looking at it kind of upside down. So what we're looking at are the tibia and the fibula. So those would normally be the bottom parts of your leg, but we've turned them upside down for photographs. And just like we've seen in the other tissue, we're seeing both the smooth edge as it's cut. You can see that it's almost a flat end, right? And that's demonstrated by the red arrows. But the green arrow is showing you a step or an irregularity, in the way that that bone is cut. So we're seeing some evidence of a sharp force that's not clean all the way through, but kind of jagged cuts on top of the bone. And again, I'm using my left hand to make kind of a sawing motion to demonstrate the movement.
Thank you. What is shown in slide 30?
In slide 30, now we have reflected the skin from that knee. You can see that this looks very different from the remainder of the tissue. On the outside, it wasn't as parchment-like, it wasn't as dried, and you can also see here that the fat has stayed yellow as it would, and that the muscle is pink. So this bone and muscle tissue and soft tissue is better preserved than that right leg, left thigh, and left foot. Again, there's no hemorrhage here either. Even though we have very good soft tissue, we don't have a lot of putrefaction and no artifact, there's absolutely no hemorrhage here.
In slide 31. What are we observing in slide 31?
In slide 31, we have removed all of the soft tissue from the bone. And at this point, before we involve the anthropologist and before the bones are prepared for that examination, I am just putting together the bones of the left thigh and the left knee. You can see, identified by the L-shaped ruler, you can actually see the linear, irregular kind of line across the bone. That is where the end of the left thigh and the end of the femur of the knee are put back together, and that they approximate very nicely. They come right back together like pieces of a puzzle.
So does that suggest that they were at one point the full leg?
To me, yes, this indicates that these pieces of bone are from the same leg.
And turning to your last slide, what does slide 32 show us?
Slide 32 is that same process. Remove the bone from the distal portion or the entire knee, and I put that left foot and the left leg back together. You can see that the large bone right in the front of the photograph has a bit of a gap. That's just a piece of tissue that's gone, and of that bone that's gone and not going to be recovered, probably because of the tool that was used to separate them. But those pieces do come together. And to the left of that, you can see the fibula, and you can see how those two pieces of bone come nicely together.
Again, fitting them like puzzle pieces, demonstrating that they're of the same leg.
Yes.
Now, doctor, you have a name on your report of who you believed these legs belonged to, Krista Halderson. Is that correct?
Correct.
How did you come to identify that these legs belonged to Krista Halderson?
We collected DNA samples from the fragments of tissue. The tissue from the left knee that was pink was still viable for DNA analysis. And the crime laboratory made a comparison and identified the remains as that of Krista R. Halderson.
And doctor, in doing your autopsy of these legs, were you able to determine a cause of death?
Not specifically, no.
What, if anything, were you able to report?
Well, I do know that there are sharp force injuries, and I do see that there are blunt force injuries. But again, as we've already mentioned, these are post-mortem. So I don't actually know what injury caused the death of Krista Halderson. But I believe that she died as a result of some violence, a non-natural death. And the cause of death is described as homicidal violence.
And that would be the manner of death.
The manner of death is homicide.
But again, you don't know the specifics. She could have been shot, strangled. You have no information to determine.
That's correct. We don't have anything other than the legs to make that determination.
No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Thank you. Good morning, doctor.
Good morning.
Just a couple questions for you. We had looked at page 15, if you don't mind turning to page 15. I believe it was the knee, and there was a defect that you spent some time talking about. As far as that defect goes, I believe you mentioned that it could be some type of stabbing, correct?
Sharp force injury, yep.
And just to confirm, that defect happened post-mortem as well? Yes?
Correct. If it is a stab wound or an incision, it is post-mortem as well.
Now, bringing your attention to the cause of death, you had mentioned that you can't specify what exactly the cause of death is, correct?
Correct.
And when we're talking about cause of death, we're talking about, as Attorney Raymond said, gunshot wounds, stabbing, strangling, something along those lines, correct?
Correct.
Now, when we're talking about the manner of death being homicide, how is it that you determined that it was a homicide?
It's the totality of the events. It's the fact that we have a pair of legs that are separated from the head, a torso, and its related extremities. The fact that these remains have been dismembered from an individual post-mortem, that there is an attempt to hide these remains. And it's also in conjunction with what we know about the death of Bart Halderson. We believe that this all occurred at relatively the same time under the same circumstances.
So it sounds like you're using a lot of different factors other than just the legs in and of themselves to determine that homicide was a manner of death.
Yes, although I will say that I have no explanation for why these two legs would be found in a state park in the course of a natural death. There's no way that I could call this anything natural. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so let me see if I can kind of understand that. The fact that the legs were found where they were is something that you use to determine a homicide versus a natural death.
It's part of what we use to determine the manner as a homicide, yes.
And I guess that ultimately is the issue. You just have a pair of legs. You can't really determine much from the legs in and of itself.
Well, I can determine that the dismemberment occurred. They didn't fall off. They were actually taken off the body. I can determine that we have different types of injuries. We have sharp force injuries and blunt force injuries. I can also determine that this happened post-mortem. So there are a few things that I can determine, but you're correct that there's a limit to what I can say.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Any redirect?
One follow-up question. So, doctor, is it fair to say that your determination is based on the totality of all of the evidence that you know at the time and not just a decision made in a vacuum?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Nothing further.
I actually have a clarification question, Doctor, and it has to do with both the use of the term and the description of movement that you've made, reference sawing. You're testifying about that movement or that style of motion and not about whatever implement was used at the time of that motion. Is that correct?
That is correct. As a forensic pathologist, my ability to determine tool marks is limited. However, we know forensically that when we see those kinds of skin tags, that is usually the result of a motion of a sharp object, either a sawing or a stabbing motion.
Thank you. Any questions in a follow-up to my question
No, Your Honor.
from
No.
defense?
No, thank you.
May this witness be excused
She may.
and released?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'll take the exhibits that are there with you.